righty. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. You know, when I'm doing something for like visitors, whether it's a bar mitzvah or a funeral, I say Shabbat Shalom, silence. And when I say it here, it's like, somebody say something? So some guy up there talking, what is he? Is he the rabbi? What is he? It's okay. Shabbat Shalom, we're on the air. That's what I should say. I keep joking, we're gonna get an applause sign and hang it there. And we'll no. We're going to continue being in person just as long as we possibly can until monkeypox is airborne. So, but to those watching at home and to those of you thinking about the holidays, we will also be streaming on the holidays on YouTube and it'll be recorded for your convenience as well. I bring up the streaming tonight because this particular Shabbat, we are, I believe, being joined by members of the Society for Humanistic Judaism and fans of Jews for a Secular Democracy throughout the country. And so they'll be listening in on my, I hate to tell you this, and I don't usually do this, but it's a little bit of a lengthy talk, and I cannot tell you how much I cut. But I think that it will be worth it for us to hear some of this. Some of it you know, some of it you'll learn more from. So we're going to get started right away, and I want to acknowledge, as always, our readers for tonight. Lonnie Fleischer, Rosalie Young, hi Rosalie, Sybil Offen, very happy to say Sybil's name, Dr. Bruce Hillenberg, who did such a great job last week. Thank you once again for that amazing presentation and calming presentation, and Rabbi Miriam Jaris. We'll begin with slide number 1. A poem by a woman known simply as Zelda the Poet. To light candles everywhere, that is Shabbat. To light Shabbat candles is a leap of our spirits, pregnant with potential into a splendid sea, where we may contemplate the mystery of the fire of sunset. Lighting the candles transforms our room into that legendary river of fire, where our hearts set in an emerald waterfall. I'd like to invite Susie Friedman to light our Shabbat candles.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
When we meet each other on Shabbat, we think of Shalom, peace. It's right there in the greeting. Shabbat has always been a symbol of peace. Our ancestors called it a taste of the world to come. The peace that they sought to create on Shabbat teased them with hopes that such calm might one day prevail throughout the world. Perhaps it was just a fantasy, but it gave them comfort, nonetheless. Today we understand that if we desire such a world, it must come through our own work. Perhaps Shabbat can remind us of that. Shabbat Shalom, to a Sabbath of peace.
Yaakov, oh halacha
משכנותיך ישראל, מה טובו אוהליך יעקב, אוהליך יעקב, משכנותיך ישראל. לקראת שבת לכו ונלכה, לכו ונלכה, כי מקור הברכה, מקור הברכה. מה טובו אוהליך יעקב, אוהליך יעקב, משכנותיך ישראל. מה טובו אוהליך יעקב, אוהליך יעקב, משכנותיך
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
As one with our forebears, we affirm that righteousness and enlightenment shall be our torch. We shall teach these values diligently to our children all the days of our lives. We shall endeavor to live by these values in the comfort of our homes or on cold and windswept roads. Whether adversity bows our heads or fulfillment makes our spirits soar, our hands shall mete out justice to all, and our eyes shall be open to the light of truth. We shall emblazon our paths through life with this light as a beacon for all humanity.
תקוותי בי, איפה כוחי, כוחי בי, וגם בך, וגם בך, איפה כוחי, כוחי בי, וגם בך, וגם בך. Where is my light? My light is in me. Where is my hope? My hope is in me. Where is my strength? My strength is in me. And in you, and in you. Where is my strength? My strength is in me, and in you, and in you.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
And happy Women's Equality Day. Let us strive to lead loving, compassionate lives with our hearts, with our wisdom, and with our actions. These words we inscribe in our innermost being, aspiring to practice them day and night, teaching them diligently to our children, through our words and especially through our deeds, so that the next generations may learn to revere and celebrate life.
חפץ חיים, אוהב ימים לראותו. מי האיש החפץ חיים, אוהב ימים לראותו. נצור לשונך נרא ושפתיך מדבר מרמה. סור נרא ועשה טוב, בקש שלום ורודפהו. נצור לשונך נרא ושפתיך מדבר מרמה. סור מרע ועשה טוב, בקש שלום ורודפהו. מי האיש החפץ חיים, אוהב ימים לראותו.
Robert Ingersoll, one of the towering humanists of the 19th century, wrote, "If abuses are destroyed, we must destroy them. If slaves are freed, we must free them. If new truths are discovered, we must discover them. If the naked are clothed, if the hungry are fed, if justice is done, if labor is rewarded, if superstition is driven from the mind, if the defenseless are protected, and if right finally triumphs, all must be the work of our hands. The grand victories of the future must be won by us and by us alone."
לא לך המלאכה לגמור, לא לך לגמור. לא לך המלאכה לגמור, לא לך לגמור. ולא אתה בן חורי לבטל ממנה, ולא אתה בן חורי, ולא אתה בן חורי לבטל ממנה, ולא אתה בן חורי. עליך המלאכה לגמור, לא עליך לגמור. לא עליך המלאכה לגמור, לא עליך לגמור. ולא אתה בן חורין להיבטל ממנה, ולא אתה בן חורין, ולא אתה בן חורין להיבטל ממנה, ולא אתה בן חורין. I grew up with it.
You're younger than I am. Isaiah prophesied, "They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." The poet Yehuda Amichai wrote, "Don't stop after beating the swords into plowshares. Don't stop. Go on beating and making musical instruments out of them. Whoever wants to make war again will have to turn them into the plowshares first."
Na'aseh shalom, shalom ba'olam. Na'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam ve'himru shalom. Na'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam ve'himru shalom. Na'aseh shalom, shalom ba'olam. Na'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam ve'imru shalom. In this community where we find strength and common purpose, we turn our minds and hearts toward all those who need our love and support. Those who are ill, those who suffer pain of the body or spirit, those who are lonely, those who have been wronged. Tonight, our well wishes are extended to these members of our community and their loved ones, to Joe Gaydon, Ruthie Goldman, Max Lark, Deborah Luria, and Rabbi Peter Schweitzer. And if there's someone you're thinking about whose name you would like to add to that list, we'll start over here. Anybody on the side? Over in this section? No? Over here? Good. I like it when there's not names to add to the sick. May all who suffer know that they are not alone. May they be healed quickly. May they experience a refuah shlema, complete recovery, the renewal of their bodies, and the renewal of their spirits. Mekorot habracha michavrotenu. May the source of strength that dwells so deep within us help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say shalom. Mekom hakoach betocheinu, mekorot habracha michavrotenu. May those in need of healing know refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say shalom. If I should die and leave you here a while, be not like others, sore undone, who keep long vigil by the silent dust. For my sake, turn again to life and smile, nerving thy heart and trembling hand to do something to comfort other hearts than mine. Complete these dear unfinished tasks of mine, and I perchance may therein comfort you. Our thoughts turn to those who are no longer with us, our own loved ones, those whom our friends and neighbors have lost, the martyrs of our people whose graves are unmarked, and those of every people and nation whose lives have been a blessing to humanity. As we remember them, we meditate on the meaning of love and loss, life and death. We recall now our loved ones whom death has recently taken from us, those who died at this season in years past, and those whom we've taken into our hearts with our own. On this Shabbat, we observe the yard sites of these loved ones and members of our congregation, of John Gardone, Jacqueline Gibbs, Gabriel Lasker, Michael Muroff, Sally Saginaw, Rose Weisenstein, and Cheryl Young. If there's someone whom you're thinking about who's no longer with us, Lonnie. Anybody else on this side? Over up here, anybody? Yehi zichram livracha. May memories of these people be a blessing to us. Grant us a measure of comfort as we go through our lives without them. If you can do so comfortably, please rise for our humanistic interpretation of Kaddish. Together, Nit gadal v'nit kadach beruach ha'adam. Let us dignify and ennoble all people in the spirit of our shared humanity. Let us acclaim the preciousness of life. Let us show gratitude for life by approaching it with reverence. Let us embrace the whole world, even as we wrestle with its parts. Let us each in our own way take up our share in serving the world and seeking truth. May our commitment to life help us to strengthen healing of spirit and peace of mind. May justice and peace permeate and comfort the house of Israel and all those who dwell on earth. And let us say, Ken Yehi, may it be so. Please be seated. I'm going to do things a little different tonight. So I mentioned it's a kind of a long talk. This isn't the only reason I'm sitting, but if you have questions about that, maybe I'll answer them later. Okay, Arthur, please go to the first slide, which you already have, which I call this lecture, Christian Nationalism Ascendant, or the Rise of the Nat-Sees. Hoping that will catch on. The more I learn, the more I think it deserves it. Yeah. All right, that better? We got it on really loud, so. A few years ago, I gave a much more reduced talk about the rise of Christian nationalism, and I predicted at that time that it was going to crescendo and then eventually go away. And this is my way of saying, boy, was I wrong. It is getting much worse. So before I begin, I want to just make a few notes. First of all, I want to thank you. I want to give a thank you to the many people who sent me articles, videos, texts, telegrams, and smoke signals with specific examples from our local and national news about what's coming, what's been going on with this issue. And I promise I will mention them all, and so settle in, we'll be here till midnight. Seriously, though, no, even though I cannot possibly mention them all, I did want to thank you. There are so many examples that I can really only talk about a few of them, and that's in a longish talk. Arthur, if you'll turn the slide, please. Oh, and then one more. I forgot the first one. This was just for illustration. Fun. I want to give some credit tonight to the author of this book, Annika Brockschmidt, and also to her collaborator, Professor Thomas Lecoq. Brockschmidt is the author of this book, Amerikas Gotteskrieger, America's Holy Warriors, How the Religious Right Endangers Democracy. And I will tell you, this is a book that ironically is only available in German. I happen to get a hold of, through the Bulwark and some other sources, some major translated excerpts, and they sort of help me to codify my thinking. There are other sources as well that I'll be noting as we go through the night. So let's start with the question of questions. What is Christian nationalism? What do we mean by this? Well, it's basically the idea that the United States is a Christian nation. Now, you grew up hearing this, right? And I grew up hearing this too. But this goes much further, much further. At the Federalist website, actually, federalist.com, a Christian nationalist named Karina Benson recently wrote defending the concept. She said this: the Declaration of Independence vests the sovereign power with the people. It entrusts the state with the responsibility of safeguarding the individual's, quote, creator-endowed rights. The signers, she writes, appealed to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of their intentions and committed themselves to the protection of divine providence. This is her words. These are her words. If nationalists believe that government should prioritize the interests of the country and the people, America first. Christian nationalists believe, as did the founders, she claims, that they must do so under the banner of God. Now, this is an obvious misreading of the intention of the founders, but listen to what she says next. The United States is not special because it's a nation chosen by God. It's special because it's a nation that chose God. The implications, she writes, are entirely biblical. Holy Scripture invites individuals from every race, tribe, nation, and language to freely enter, right, into a personal relationship with the Savior, to live by his commandments and worship him as king. It also envisages, she says, from Genesis to Isaiah, from the Gospels to the book of Revelation, the conversion of whole nations or peoples, and warns of the inevitable harm of instead embracing a culture of idolatry, depravity, and deceit. She's talking about us. Hence, we read in Proverbs that a nation without God's guidance is a nation without order. So there you have it, right from the mouths of a very, very intellectualized, that's what the Federalist movement is about, Christian nationalist. Brock-Schmidt responds. She brings the Benton to her book. What Christian nationalists are actually advocating is a cultural and religious conversion to a dominant strand of Christian thought by everyone in this country. So much for freely coming to the Savior. Here's another definition, also published in the Federalist by Matthew Corcoran a few years ago. He defines Christian nationalism as a rejection of the religious neutrality of the late 20th century, in favor of one, a recognition that Christianity has had a unique and privileged influence on our American heritage that overshadows the importance or influence of any other religions. Number two, a conviction that a Christian understanding of the world should predominate over other worldviews in America's civil life. And three, an understanding that a nation that successfully excised or sufficiently diluted these influences could no longer be called American in the same sense as before. I hope I've made the point. I want to look at it now from a slightly less academic, or if you will, pseudo-academic standpoint. Next picture, please. Talk about this picture in just a moment. First, I want to teach you a little Christian concept. You're going to learn a few, or at least a Christian nationalist concept. You're going to learn a few tonight. First, let me introduce you to the role of what's known as a watchman. A watchman is a person who is either self-appointed, as we would recognize as the truth, or believes themselves to have been called upon to take on a whole slew of special religious obligations, but that are ultimately meant to establish a divine government by the church in order to prepare the way of the Lord and carry out the word of the Lord. Evangelist Kenneth Copeland, some of you may know who he is. He has a show called Flashpoint. He's very well known in these circles. He penned what he calls the Watchman's Decree. It's recited at most, really all gatherings these days of Christian nationalists. This is an example from, I don't know, there must have been 10,000 people here at the, reading this in unison. I almost played the recording, but it was really hard to understand, so I'm going to read it to you. But they recited in unison this pledge that I'm going to share with you now. I'm going to read the whole thing. As a patriot of faith, I attest my allegiance first and foremost to the kingdom of God and the Great Commission. That's the commission to go evangelize. Secondly, I agree to be a watchman over our nation concerning its people and their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Whereas we, the church, are God's governing body on earth. They're in charge. We have been given legal power from heaven and now exercise our authority. We are God's ambassadors and spokespeople over the earth. Through the power of God, we are the world's influencers. Because of our covenant with God, we are equipped and delegated by him to destroy every attempted advance of the enemy. Look around, you'll see the enemy. We make our declarations. We decree that America's executive branch of government will honor God and defend the Constitution. We decree that our legislative branch of Congress will write only laws that are righteous and constitutional. We decree that our judicial system will issue rulings that are biblical and constitutional. We declare that we stand against wokeness, the occult, and every evil attempt against our nation. We declare and we now take back our God-given freedoms according to our Constitution. We declare that we take back influence at the local level in our communities. We decree that we take back and permanently control positions of influence and leadership in each of the 7 mountains. I'll explain the mountains in a minute. We decree that the blood of Jesus covers and protects our nation. It protects and separates us for God. We declare that our nation is energy dependent. We declare that America is strong spiritually, financially, militarily, and technologically. We decree that evil carries no power, authority, or rights in our land or over our people. We decree that we will operate in unity, going beyond denominational lines in order to accomplish the purposes of God for our nation. And we decree that America shall be saved. By the way, in the printed edition, that's all in caps. We know this country was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. Talk about that later. We know the truth, therefore we stand for truth and will never be deceived. Capitalized again. We will never stop fighting. We will never, ever, ever give up or give in. We will take our country back. The emphases are theirs. We will honor the one true God. And then a bunch of Bible stuff I'm not going to bother you with, just because it's too much already. Now, so far I've only shared with you their words. No one should argue that I'm exaggerating this. No one should think that I am somehow being hyperbolic or blowing this out of proportion or saying that this is fringe in any way. Next slide, please. Now, none of this is really new. It's been going on for a long time. It began with the rise of the religious right in the 1970s. That's when Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and others began to explicitly mix politics and evangelical religion, which, by the way, was previously very unpopular in evangelical circles. They were gathering in, coming in. This was the spiritual realm. They believed the world was not right, but they didn't believe they should take over the government in order to answer that. And there were many conservatives who had very, very big problems with this. Noteworthy for this was Barry Goldwater, who warned in a very now famous speech about it. By the way, his wife was one of the co-founders of Planned Parenthood in Arizona. Just to give you a little bit of perspective here. One of the major outcomes of this, of course, was the founding of the Moral Majority and other fellow traveler groups. That one founded in 1979 by Jerry Falwell, not the one we know now, who's got his own problems. But in any case, none of this began with Trump. None of this began 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Certainly his authoritarian populism, which I'm going to talk about, of course, brought it to the heights of power. But it's been a threat for a long time now, and I would say, notably, our movement has been in the forefront. You have an opportunity to go to sherwinwine.com, which is being revamped. There's going to be thousands of lectures on there. Search the Moral Majority. Search some of these things. Sherwin was outspoken. In fact, my speech got a little overtaken at one point with all the quotes, so that's the only reason I'm not quoting him, is because it would have been all Sherwin. But he was very pointed about this. And that's before it moved to front and center in our nation. In 2006, Michelle Goldberg, a columnist for the New York Times, had already written a history of Christian nationalism in a book called Kingdom Come, where she reviewed what had happened until 2006. Maybe, again, like I was, a little bit too optimistic that this may be coming to an end someday. She writes, under the Bush administration, we already had a constantly shifting menagerie of conservative Christian pastors, homeschool groups, political action committees, and even judges who made it their mission to, quote, restore America to something that matched their deeply conservative understanding of Christianity. Their core project, she wrote, was to reject secular society and replace it with one where the Bible, or at least their interpretation of it, was the sole arbiter of truth. You were already seeing under Bush, she says, this systematic creation of an entire alternative reality that really started on the Christian right in terms of the creation of not just alternative science, but the idea that secularism, all of secular knowledge, history, and reality was just one worldview, and then anything that emerged from secular presuppositions should be ignored. Now, in her book, she traces its origins to an offshoot of a fringe theology called Christian Reconstructionism. So throughout the 20th century, preachers you never heard of advocated for this kind of complete transformation of American society into this full-on conservative Christian theocracy. Public schools, for instance, in their mind, should be closed and replaced with religious institutions. They even suggested implementing the death penalty for LGBTQ people, women who had sex out of wedlock, and others they believed to be sinners. Sounds a little like Gilead, right, in that novel by Margaret Atwood in the TV show. This theology, though, morphed into something slightly more respectable. Today we call it Christian dominionism, or dominion theology. Dominion theology, like much else in Christian nationalism, has scriptural roots, or at least according to their interpretation. And there is, of course, in Genesis, a passage in which Adam and Eve are commanded by God to have dominion over the earth, in a popular English translation. Those who believe it, it means that Christians now must take up this charge in the political realm. America should be ruled by, even exclusively made up of, conservative Christians. All of this, and so much more, was on display in that Watchman's Decree, which is repeated over and over. One of the things that came from that, you heard, was the 7 mountains. This comes from a couple of verses in the Bible, one from the book of Revelation in the New Testament, which says, "Here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains." You know, the book of Revelation has the 7-headed, anyway, not worth getting into. What are the 7 mountains that they've figured? Of course, all in the Bible, right? Family, religion, education, media, entertainment, business, and government. In Isaiah, from our Bible, there is a verse which they woefully mistranslate, which says, "It will come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains." And those are the mountains they think are being discussed in Revelation. And in order to reestablish the Lord's house, you must take control of the 7 mountains, just as they declared. Until that happens, there will be no end times. And end times, folks, is what this is all about. The rapture, the assumption to heaven, and the punishment for the rest of us. Now, in terms of American nationalism, it's impossible, Christian nationalism, it's impossible to understand it without also taking a look at long-standing Christian right-wing historical revisionism. This has spread through their movement. It's a revisionism that begins with the kinds of lies, really, about the intent of the founders that I mentioned earlier in Karina Benton's quote. And these lies teach that they intended, the founders did, to create a Christian nation, not one that would be religiously neutral, that would welcome all peoples and faiths. That particular letter by George Washington be damned. Some sociological research by Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead, who wrote a book called Taking America Back for God, it's an analysis of this movement, reveal that this historical, mythic, one might call it nostalgia, is a highly significant element of the Christian nationalist worldview. This is what permits her to write, "We are the nation that chose God." Surveys that they've analyzed, including one published by Baylor University, which, as you probably know, is not exactly a secular place, reveal that white Christian Americans who agree on the following ideas are also powerfully identifying themselves with this nostalgic, mythical story of America at a very deep level. These are the kinds of people who say that the United States is a Christian nation. They deny any need for separation of church and state. They view as favorable government advocacy of specifically Christian values and beliefs. They welcome authoritarian approaches that will ingrain these ideas in our culture. Perry and Whitehead found that Christian nationalism was a significant and consistent predictor of anti-immigrant stereotypes, of racial prejudice, of dehumanization of all sorts of outlier groups, and so forth. And this brings me to a very, very central and important point, one that I was hesitant originally to address, but through all of the reading and study I did, I'm convinced that what I've learned is correct, and I think reality bears out, which is the fact that Christian nationalism is increasingly indistinguishable from white Christian nationalism. Brock Schmidt explicitly connects this historical revisionism in the movement's inherent racism. She writes, I assume this is a good translation, "This warped version of American history holds that the United States was supposed to be an explicitly Christian country, founded by and for Christian people, and that this is often understood explicitly to mean white Christian people. It's a bad history that has been disproved, of course, time and time again, but it is central to the self-appointed legitimacy of Christian nationalists." She concludes, "White supremacy runs through the veins of white Christian nationalism." Now, I want to note that there are vehement denials in that particular article I began with in the Federalist by Bentham. There are vehement denials among many Christian nationalists that their movement of Christian nationalism has anything to do with race. And to be sure, there are a handful of Christian nationalists, including a couple that are quite prominent, who are not white. But there are plenty of reasons to believe that this is true, despite the fact that they emphasize Christian nationalism's colorblindness, as they call it. For while Christian nationalists may not explicitly include black people, though their numbers are minute, and in the other book I found testimony after testimony after testimony of black people, Americans who had attended their churches only to discover this the hard way. Their mythic revisionist version of American history, of course, denies the awfulness of slavery. You've seen this. Or that slavery was any kind of motivation for the Civil War. Their current political rhetoric completely negates the existence of systemic racism, backing the blue when it's convenient, not of course when they're storming the Capitol, over and against the claims of what we might call the new black civil rights movement. This, of course, accounts for the demonization of Black Lives Matter, which has been called every name in the book. Teaching Black American history, therefore, calls their historical truths and sacred symbols into question. The 1619 Project, for instance, which seeks to retell the story of America with more black voices. Or, you want to get a little nostalgic on our own, even Alex Haley's Roots. These call their truths and sacred symbols into question. This is something they will not countenance. The result, of course, is that they twist history so that the experience of white people is elevated above the voices and experiences of others. This is why, and I've spoken about it on Friday nights before, they have labeled critical race theory something they barely understand, but which they know violates their myth as racist. Proclaiming, as one of their leaders recently did, we will not have our students indoctrinated with progressive politics, critical race theory, and other racist, divisive policies. You see how they turn racism on its head. Passing laws. Over 25 states are considering or have passed laws that preclude teachers from exploring American or state histories of enslavement if any student should feel discomfort, guilt, or anguish on account of the individual's race or sex. All right, this is important, but so is a lot of the rest of what I need to say. So I'm going to move on. We could devote a seminar to that. A course. The next picture, please. You can guess what the topic of this section is. What was, after all, Trump's role here? I mean, did anybody ever who heard of this guy back in the day think, there goes a great Christian? How does such an obviously non-Christian man become the leader? Well, we know how. The man knows how to exploit things. And Christian nationalism, which used to be hidden under theological language, as it became more explicit, came much more into the center of Donald Trump's attention. We know his racist background. We know that kind of thing. And it jives so easily with many of their ideas. We'll talk about what some of them are. Now, a spark, just to walk us back a couple of minutes, a spark for his popularity, of course, that's why I mentioned the racial angles, was the Obama election, right? But it wasn't the only thing, though that certainly brought him into prominence. They were looking for a leader who would give attention to and fan the flames of resentment over the increased openness of sexual minorities, the danger of gay marriage, which happened towards the end of Obama's administration, the increasingly changing role of women in society, the perceived takeover of politics in our country, was not true, of course, by the progressives, demonized as Antifa. They resented, of course, as I just mentioned, the reexamination of America's racial history, anything that violated the nostalgic myth. And along comes Donald Trump to exploit their antipathy to these things and other things, developing and cultivating very specifically. Look at some of the pictures of him with the prayer leaders. These are not isolated pictures. I had to choose from dozens, hundreds in some cases, to put one slide together. It is no exaggeration to say that his base primarily comprised of white evangelical Christians. Now, he did get 8% of the vote, the black vote, in the last election, and there are reasons for that we don't have time to go into. He got 92% in his best showing, voted against him. America's blacks know exactly what's going on here, and they are not a non-religious community. These are people who are very often devoted and devout Christians. I work with them on civil rights and social justice issues, but they see through this like a laser through cheese. How has he created this image of himself as the defender of Christianity? Well, he lets others do it for him. One of them is that blonde woman there. No offense to blondes, that wasn't it's the woman part. With her hands on his elbow, Paula White, the prosperity gospel woman, who basically exists to take and separate people from their money, and therefore you can understand her the way she vibes with Mr. Trump. But listen to what she says. I absolutely can tell you that Mr. Trump has a relationship with God. He is a Christian. He accepts Jesus as his Lord and Savior. They say about our president, well, he's not presidential, though. Thank goodness, thank goodness, thank goodness. And I mean that with all due respect, because he's not a polished politician. He is authentically, whether people like it or not, raised up by God. God says that he raises up and places people in positions of authority. It is God, she says, who raises up a king. We used to have that belief. It is God that sets one down. When you fight against the plan of God, you are fighting against the hand of God, meaning Donald J. Trump. I should also add this, and I only thought of it as I was considering his response to all of what's been happening in Mar-a-Lago, that his certain attitude of victimization kind of perfectly matches the victimization stance of Christian nationalism. War on Christmas, anyone? All right, the next one, please. So now in the second part of my talk, I want to address particularly two questions. One we're going to get rid of very quickly, and the other which is going to take us into some of what you sent me, as much as I could use, and some other things too. So first, how popular is this really? The second is, what means are they using to gain and retain power? Now here's where you all know a lot more than maybe you knew about the book of Revelation or the Seven Mountains. The first question, how popular are they? Well, at the recent CPAC meeting, which is the largest gathering of so-called conservatives, and I'm holding that word in abeyance, certainly lately conservative Christians, that's not inappropriate. But the recent CPAC meeting, Marjorie Taylor Greene said, when I say that I'm a Christian nationalist, I have nothing to be ashamed of, because that's what most Americans are. Is she right? Well, she may be close. In Taking America Back for God, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry presented research that demonstrated that a little more than half of American adults, 51.9%, are either strongly supportive of, that would be closer to 20%, or at least somewhat positively inclined, over 32%, to notions of Christian nationalism. This is based on their analyses of questions in that 2017 Baylor Religion Survey. So not a biased survey at all. In any case, whether they are a majority or not, they have much and growing power. And we know why. I don't have to go into great depth with this. We have inherent issues with our Constitution. It was written for a different era, with different people in mind. The Electoral College is a disaster. The composition of the Senate makes it highly unrepresentative that Montana or Wyoming receive 2. Or I'll even say Rhode Island, with liberal state, receive 2, and California receive 2. We have gerrymandering. We may have taken care of that to a great extent here in Michigan, but we know that it is a plague in many other states. So the question of popularity is really secondary to the question of the means by which they are using to gain, as they have, and now retain the great power that they possess. Let's start with, and this is probably the most significant piece that I'm going to talk about, the courts. The courts are the source right now of a growing erasure of the separation between church and state. They are now increasingly committed to undermining and effectively eliminating the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which has always been understood to indicate a separation of church and state. And I'm going to show you the legal means and thinking behind what they're doing. and I'm not an attorney, so please forgive me. I'm getting this from a million sources and trying to consolidate it so that my mind can understand it, and I hope I will explain it correctly. But what they have essentially done is to put the Establishment Clause in competition with the Free Exercise Clause. The two have been placed in conflict. Now, it's difficult to understand, but let's start with just a reminder of what the First Amendment says with respect to religion. It says this: first, Congress, meaning the government, and then that was extended to the states, shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That's our Establishment Clause. And then it goes on to say this: or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This is known as the Free Exercise Clause, and in some religious Christian circles, it's called the Religious Liberty Clause. The Establishment Clause has been traditionally understood as requiring complete religious neutrality, Jefferson's wall of separation, by the government. The Free Exercise Clause, on the other hand, in a non-conflicting way, was traditionally understood as protecting citizens' rights to practice their religion as they please, so long as their practice of that religion does not run afoul of public morals, which we never really understood what that is, or afoul of a compelling government interest. And promoting the Establishment Clause itself has frequently been seen as a compelling government interest that puts the brakes on your free exercise. Clear so far? It meant that people were generally free to exercise their religion, but that there were limits. And those limits did not allow you to practice your religion in violation of neutral or generally applicable laws. Those could include anti-discrimination laws, such as those that ban discrimination against LGBTQ people. Or those general laws may be things that they passed in legislatures to ensure that religion and government wasn't mixing too much. That's what I mean. For those of you who shook your heads no, that's what I mean. Your free exercise has limits. This is how it's always been understood. You can't use your free exercise to discriminate and so forth, and you can't use the Free Exercise Clause to establish a preference for religion among the government. I hope it's clear now. It requires a re-understanding, a redefinition of the Free Exercise Clause, the Christian Religious Liberty Clause, in order to see what's been done to it. The damage started in 1993 with what at the time seemed like a benevolent piece of legislation. It was called RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It had to do with smoking peyote for an Indian tribe where it was illegal. And the government passed a law saying, you know, there's no compelling government interest in saying that we can't, that we have to prohibit them from practicing their religion with peyote. So we're going to pass a law. If there's no compelling government interest, then your religious practice gets benefit of the doubt and maybe even preference. So that began to extend the free exercise legislatively. It became, what happened as a result, though, is that Christian nationalists have taken the entire notion much further. And what they've done is to create what we now call a doctrine of extreme religious liberty. That arguments about compelling government reasons or about limiting the establishment, those are subservient to people's rights to do whatever they want religiously. Here's an example that you might not have realized was really about this. It was just decided this session when the court ruled 6-3 in the case of Carson versus Macon that Maine and other states must fund private religious schools if they fund any private schools at all, regardless of whether those funds are used for religious instruction or worship. Now, the state of Maine's ban on such funding was created because they believed that the establishment cause gave them a compelling government interest not to be giving taxpayer money so people could learn about the 7 mountains and the blood of Jesus. Or, the Torah, or the Quran, or whatever it is. They actually, according to what I've read, they have a paucity of public schools in certain places, and it was more financially, manageable for them to fund secular private schools. Now, they have to make the decision to either drop the funding of those secular schools or fund religious education. Extreme religious liberty arguments are also behind the permission that some religious groups seek to discriminate against LGBTQ people, as I've mentioned. As we've seen, they will do that. Of course, the ridiculous wedding cake arguments, which don't interest me as much, but which should interest all of us, when a Christian adoption agency funded by the state on its religious principles to only place children in Christian homes refuses a Jewish couple or other non-Christian couple adoption. We're going to see this coming out. There was a case that was coming that went through it, and then when another adoption agency came through, I think the couple dropped it, but we're going to be seeing this one addressed. Not only do these rulings run roughshod over the Establishment Clause by claiming that there's no compelling government interest in treating religion neutrally, they give the appearance of actually establishing a religion. If not, say, Calvinism over Catholicism, then certainly conservative Christianity over liberal Christianity or Reform Judaism or other progressive religious faiths. I'm going to give you an example. This is the one I've been worried most about because it's a little complicated. I'm going to do my best. Many of you have sent me, probably all of you at some point, have sent me an article about my colleague Rabbi Barry Silver and his lawsuit against the state of Florida about their restrictive abortion laws. You familiar with this? Now, Barry Silver, I knew him, actually, my mother used to live next to his father, and we spent Shabbat at their house occasionally. Rabbi Silver and his supporters decided to use the Free Exercise Clause in their claim that Florida's restrictive abortion law denies them their free exercise of religion by ignoring liberal Jewish rights and sometimes recommendations for abortion. We all know this. This has been discussed quite a bit since Dobbs. It was mentioned at that wonderful National Council of Jewish Women. I know I'm not supposed to say this, God bless them. One of the best organizations the Jewish world has ever produced. At that wonderful assembly that we had with hundreds of people at Temple Israel after Dobbs, it was discussed. Some of us had similar arguments, we never got them to court, about same-sex marriages. There were Reform rabbis who said, hello, it's my religious commitment to join a same-sex couple in matrimony. You're violating my free exercise. That one never got to court. Well, now you would think, checkmate, Christian nationalists. See what will happen if you take free exercise too far? Well, as it turns out, and you don't have to look as far as you used to, some Christian nationalists are already addressing this. And it's their legal scholars, and they have them, as you know. Many of them went to Yale or Harvard. They are writing and beginning to teach that religious liberty, in order to be worthy of protection when it is sought, can only be worthy of protection for people following religions that believe that they must obey God or be punished. A Reformed Jew who believes in their heart that abortion must be allowed up until a certain point, and that their rabbi must be allowed to advise them to go forward and have one if their health is in danger, that person will not be punished for not having an abortion by God. This is a Christian nationalist test, religious test, that proposes that some groups' free exercise is more important than others. That in order for a government to violate your free exercise of religion, your religion must include a religious obligation to God about whether you should do or not do something. Imagine a case of an Orthodox Jewish prisoner who says, I must keep kosher. Under this doctrine of extreme religious liberty, yes, because he believes by not keeping kosher, he will face God's consequences. It's not true exactly according to Jewish law, but okay, the Christians would see it that way. But a Reformed Jew who requests kosher food in prison, you don't have to give it to him. He doesn't really believe that God will punish him. He doesn't really believe he has to observe this. Maybe the Sabbath. He might like doing it, but it's not an obligation, it's a preference. And religious preferences are not free exercise. They're just, stuff you like. This is recorded in journals now, Christian nationalist-backed journals. I read several articles about them. One of them, I hate to say, was by a Jew, but clearly one who identifies very much with Christian nationalism. They're there too. In a sense, what's occurred here then, and I hate to say this is fringe now, but so was Dominionism 6-7 years ago. What they are talking about is the establishment of religion. It is not what the founders were thinking of precisely. They were worried that America would become Presbyterians versus Catholics. That was their experience in the British Isles. But today, Catholics and evangelical Christians, they share a white Christian nationalist agenda in many cases. And in fact, there's an argument to be made that abortion emerged as the #1 issue because while Protestants weren't that concerned about it in the 1970s, Catholics were. And this brought them onto the train. All right, moving on. One last First Amendment issue. It also, I think, is probably the easier way to understand how free exercise is being abused. This is the well-publicized recent session decision in Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. You know the one. I hope you read my commentary about it, where SCOTUS sided with a public school football coach who demanded the right to pray with his players after games at the 50-yard line. They claimed that this was a personal, the justices who ruled in his favor, that this was a personal religious exercise and could not be forbidden. There's no compelling government to do so. Nothing like that all the kids are coerced. I invite you to think about how this will play out when a Muslim coach takes the 50-yard line. All right, let's move on. I'm going to go through these a little bit more quickly. In the interest of time, I'm not going to reiterate all of the things that we've talked about. The second means, I think, that by which they are going to retain or trying to retain power is authoritarianism, very much part of the Trump agenda, but also very much part of many gubernatorial agendas too. There are many state legislatures that have been weakened and are so subservient to the will of their governors due to gerrymandering that they've essentially become rubber stamps. We see Ron DeSantis, also Abbott over in Texas, but DeSantis is the one I chose, being a native Floridian, a great example of this. Consider how he handled that Disney Corporation decision. Now, I'm not going to get into the merits of whether there should ever have been this special district. I was always against it as a Floridian. But he immediately canceled a 60-year-old agreement this thick that will have enormous repercussions because he ordered the legislature to do it without thinking, without reading the bill, to punish Disney for taking a stance that was pro-gay. He has essentially, through his own personal commission, redistricted the entire state. There was no discussion about it. Rubber stamp. He is removing elected officials. You saw Andrew Warren, elected twice as state's attorney for Florida's 13th Judicial District, removed from office. He tried, and thankfully some court prohibited him from this, to prohibit private businesses from conducting inclusivity training. At least one federal court has ruled that to be a bridge too far. You can't tell a private company what they can or cannot say when they're doing a training like that that's non-discriminatory. He'll make an argument it's discriminatory, and who knows what it will look like when it works its ways up. His executive orders prohibiting businesses from requiring masks, et cetera, et cetera. Why call this authoritarian? Well, as Catherine Stewart pointed out in that recent New York Times op-ed piece that I mentioned, it's important to remember that Christian nationalism is not a social movement. It does not arise from the grassroots. It does not aim to satisfy the real needs of its base. We know what their real needs are. It's a leader-driven movement, and the leaders set the agenda. Yet another way of spreading their ideology is through, of course, voter suppression, the use of the big lie. It's so visible in support of the big lie that given the lateness of the hour, I don't think I have to go into it too much. But it should be noted, however, that what happened on January 6th is directly related. DeSantis, again, when it comes to the big lie, established an Office of Election Crimes and Security that's answerable only to himself. Ask me afterwards, and I'll tell you what they recently did, how they're embittering the lives of 20 people, former felons, who were told they could, upon passage of a law that the people voted for, registered to vote, have now been arrested and incarcerated for doing what they told was legal. What they were told was legal. And then, of course, state after state with their ridiculous laws about absentee ballots and drop-offs and no water giving out. Schools and libraries. I could do, and I probably will do, an entire lecture on this at some point. They are a primary venue for the revision, of course, of American history that we talked about. To a very great degree, the clampdown of LGBTQ students and teachers in the name of parental rights is happening in our public schools. Recent headlines have documented how schools are being punished for establishing straight-gay alliances. Teachers are losing their jobs, being forced out because they may have a picture with their spouse or their family or for other homophobic reasons. The crackdowns are numerous, and they are putting unneeded stress on already completely stressed out schools and teachers. And this has led to, if you have not seen the headlines, a national shortage of teachers, a crisis unparalleled in American history. Meanwhile, trans youth are being punished not only by laws forbidding affirmative medical care, but by laws prohibiting their participation in sports and other activities, primarily sports. Just this morning, I opened the Washington Post to see how Kentucky's lone transgender athlete has been forbidden to play on the field hockey team that she helped to establish. School libraries and public libraries together are under attack. Florida, again, a new law requiring all reading material in schools, all of it, to be selected by an employee with a valid education in media specialism, speciality, whatever they call it, a certificate. Ahead of the coming school year, the Sarasota County School District stopped all donations and purchases of books, and now I've heard others have too. You know, the schools don't have money to buy books for teachers to use in the classroom. The teachers rely on buying them themselves or getting them from donations, and they're afraid to bring those collections into school. So reading centers in classrooms throughout Florida are lacking books. And I hear this from teacher friends back home. Today's Washington Post also reported about a situation in Oklahoma where schools that have permitted so-called banned books have lost their state accreditations. Book bans and restrictions are taken off like it was the 1950s. Welcome back to the past. Attacks on media and conspiracy theories constitute another means of keeping and gaining support. I think most of us know the issues with the media's entanglement with, for their own purposes, the government. Our own John Arking talked a few weeks ago about his personal and quite universal story about what happened to him in Howell, Michigan. If you missed it, you can catch it on our YouTube channel. And there's the ongoing slandering of the media, which cows them, creating resentment and the feeling that the media are fake, enemies of the people. And the way that the right follows the Steve Bannon playbook. Jonathan Rauch's book that I reviewed a few months ago spoke about his invention of flooding the zone with shit, meaning creating so much chaos in the news that it's impossible to pay attention to any one thing for more than a moment. Now, conspiracy theories, of course, are exploited by them, if not created by them. There's overlap. There are tributaries and streams to all of this. The alt-right, the masculinity crowd, the incel crowd. They draw those people in to to gain and keep power. But ultimately, if it serves their central purpose, about which we've discussed, it remains in their toolbox. Another one, and I am getting to the end now, violence. Do not imagine for a moment that the violent rhetoric that we're hearing is a fringe feature. It is moving rapidly to the center. It is egged on by leaders of this movement. Read their tweets. Catherine Stewart again, speaking about the Road to Majority Policy Conference, which took place in June in Nashville. The rhetoric of violence, she said, among movement leaders appears to have increased significantly from already alarming levels she recalls observing in previous years. Speakers, she writes, at the conference vied to outdo one another in their denigration of Democrats, whom they described as evil, tyrannical, the enemy within, engaged in a war against truth. Senator Rick Scott of Florida said, "The backlash is coming. Mount up and ride to the sounds of the guns. They are all over this country. It is time to take this country back." Governor Mark Robinson of North Carolina said, "We are in a pitched battle to literally save this nation." Referring to a passage from the New Testament that Christian nationalists often use to signal their militancy, he added, "I don't know about you, but I've got my pack on, I got my boots on, I got my helmet on, I got on the whole armor." It is not a stretch to link this rise in verbal aggression to the disinformation campaign that indoctrinated the Christian national base in the big lie. The movement is preparing patriots, and much the way communists would call each other comrade, they now address each other as patriot. They are ready for this continuing assault on democracy. I want to emphasize that for many conservatives, and many of my sources, particularly Bulwark, but others as well, are comprised of former or current conservatives alienated by this, argue that this does not represent what their conservatism was. You can go to Bill Kristol, you can go to David French, you can go to up one side and down the other, and you will find representatives. They are not as many as they should be, but there are plenty of them. As David French put it, the minute you have the abandonment of small government principles in favor of more intrusion into people's bedrooms and privacy and businesses, you're not talking about conservatism anymore. All right, Arthur, please change the slide. Promised I was going to get out of here before 8:30, and I am. But this is a little coda, a little addendum, because we're a Jewish community, and we need to understand what this has to do the Jewish community. So I'm going to put on the other glasses. I have a lot of glasses. Okay. Anti-Semitism is a very central piece of a lot of Christian nationalist rhetoric. Do not let the pro-Israel rhetoric fool you. That is not pro-Jewish rhetoric. Do not let phony talk of Judeo-Christian values fool you. I've spoken about this before. Paul Golan, head of our movement, Society for Humanistic Judaism, spoke about it. It's a myth. From its hijacking of Israel and Zionism through an organization that dwarfs AIPAC, known as Christians United for Israel, to its apocalyptic vision of Judaism replaced by mass conversion to Christianity, to its cultural appropriations of our symbols, from the shofar to the Seder to Yom Kippur, anti-Semitism is very much on display, and we are seeing it in this campaign again. It's been visible, of course, on the alt-right, but moved to the Christian nationalist right, the Soros garbage, the adulation at CPAC of the viciously anti-democratic and anti-Semitic Viktor Orban of Hungary. Here's two last examples of 100 that I could share with you. How many of you have heard of Doug Mastriano? Doug Mastriano is the GOP nominee for governor of Pennsylvania, the state I'm about to drive through in a few days. Recently, he took to the stage, cynically appropriating Jewish symbolism, as he frequently does, blowing shofars at his rallies, etc. You know, this is Jesus symbolism, so it belongs to them, they claim. He campaigns by telling supporters, we have the power of God with us. We have Jesus Christ that we're serving here. He's guiding and directing our steps. That man employed that man there in the green hat, named Andrew Torba, as a consultant. Andrew Torba is the founder of a social media site called Gab. As reported by Jacob Kornblue of The Forward, Gab's Andrew Torba, backing Mastriano for governor and having consulted for him, calls Josh Shapiro, who is an opponent for, I believe it's the AG in Pennsylvania, and is Jewish. What is it for? Oh, he's governor, right, I'm sorry. He is the AG, he's running for governor. Calls he who is Jewish the Antichrist, then prays for his conversion. Listen to some of the quotes from Mr. Torba. They say Gab next to him, he writes these. They don't hate me, he says, they hate Christ. If you speak biblical truth just a little too boldly, they seethe into a fit of rage and surface their hatred of him just long enough for those paying attention to start taking notice. More and more people are beginning to take notice. We're building a parallel Christian society because we are fed up and done with the Judeo-Bolshevik one. And just in case anybody believed the rhetoric about Judeo-Christian, take a look at the cartoon. The nail is Judeo. Christ is the Christian killed by the nail. Next slide, please. Recognize this lovely woman? Carrie Lake. She's running for governor of Arizona. And I picked two things that just happened this week, just so you know, this week and a couple weeks ago. For some reason, God knows why, but they know each other for Christian nationalist circles, she chose to endorse the bearded guy here, named Jaron Jackson, a far-right influencer, for a seat in the Oklahoma State Senate. She later rescinded her endorsement, but only after being called out for days and days and days, and refusing to explain why she did it in the first place. But we know why. We know why. It's because she shares his Christian nationalism. Listen to what he said. I ain't owned by the Jews. I'm not beholden to Jews or any other group. The Jews, Illuminati, COVID shots kill, Rothschilds, communists, woke, pastor, social gospel, Christ will chuck a bunch of stuff in the fire. There ain't no amount of adding Judeo to the word Christian that's going to change what they really want. And it doesn't include us. Next slide, Arthur, is our last one. The late, great Isaac Asimov, a Jew and a humanist, said this: imagine the people who believe such things and who are not ashamed to ignore totally all the patient findings of thinking minds through all centuries since the Bible was written. And it is these ignorant people, the most uneducated, the most unimaginative, the most unthinking among us, and those are not necessarily all the same thing, because many of them are educated. That does not mean that they are not unthinking, who would make themselves the guides and leaders of us all, who would force their feeble and childish beliefs on us, who would invade our schools and libraries and homes and White House and Congress. I personally resent it bitterly. I do too, Isaac. Catherine Stewart said, Christian nationalism cannot be our route to the future. Its purpose is to hollow out democracy until nothing is left but a thin cover for rule by a supposedly right-thinking elite, bubble-wrapped in sanctimony and insulated from any real democratic check on its power. We have very few last opportunities now to make this go away. It's not us. I don't think there's a person in this room who doesn't vote in every election. But your children, your grandchildren, your friends and neighbors who may not be paying attention, they need to be aware that when we say our democracy is in danger, it may not only be from the Christian nationalists, but it is primarily exploited by and will be taken advantage of by them. Vote. Thank you, everybody. Okay, we're going to conclude with a happier note.
Yeah, shalom, peace.
How about a hand for Joseph Palazzolo, everybody?
Peace be with you wherever you go. Peace be with you whatever you do. Peace be with you when we meet again. Peace be with you, my friend. Love be with you wherever you go. Love be with you wherever you do. Love be with you till we meet again. Love be with you, my friend. Joy be with you wherever you go. Joy be with you whatever you do. Joy be with you till we meet again. Joy be with you, my friend. Shalom Aleichem, shalom, shalom. Shalom Aleichem, shalom, shalom. Shalom Aleichem, shalom, shalom. Shalom Aleichem, shalom.
Thank you,
Shabbat
Joseph. Thank you,
shalom.
David Weeks, for the streaming. Thanks to all who joined us from Jews for Secular Democracy, and to Arthur, who does the slide. Shabbat shalom, everyone.